This is Wayfinder's online webinar. We call it Finding Your Way. And today we have Katrina Ingram with us. She is a specialist, a professional in the ins and outs of artificial intelligence and the ethics, especially as it pertains to business, and in our case, as it pertains to small business in particular. We're just discussing how we can't really ignore this emerging force called artificial intelligence, and it's possible that many small businesses are particularly vulnerable to its influence, early adoption by larger companies, and so on. And if you don't pick it up, you could be left behind. But if you do choose to use AI, there are certain guardrails that you need to acknowledge and abide by. And Katrina has a master's degree in society and technology. Is that right, Katrina?
Communications and technology, very close.
Okay. And has become a specialist who is recognized nationally and internationally as a speaker and promoter, a courseware developer. And Katrina, let's just take it from there. Introduce yourself.
Sure, absolutely. So first and foremost, I'm a member of the Wayfinders community, and I'm happy to participate in sharing what I know because I've benefited a lot from this community. So I run a social enterprise called Ethically Aligned AI. I started my business in 2021 following that master's degree that Randall just mentioned. And the reason I'm doing this work is not because I'm particularly enamored with AI or even technology for that matter. It's because technology is really structuring a lot of the ways in which we live, our culture, what's possible, our businesses. Sometimes it does it in really overt ways that we can see, and sometimes it happens in ways that are somewhat invisible. And in a lot of cases, there can also be harms or unintended consequences or adverse impacts when we use these technologies. And so that's the part that I'm really interested in, is how do we mitigate these harms? How do we make technology that's inclusive and beneficial for everyone? So with that as my kind of preamble, let me dive into some slides here. I'm going to just pull up a deck that I have put together for today. I'll make sure.
Yeah, it's coming up.
All right, cool.
There we go.
There we go. All right. So, Finding Your Way with AI is the title of my talk. This is what we're going to cover today. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some AI basics. We will focus mostly on generative AI. It's the kind of AI you're most likely going to encounter as a small business person. And then we'll talk about risks and responsible AI use, and then we can have a little bit of Q&A after that. So let's start with some of the basics of AI. I'm going to do this in a very non-technical way. So the first thing I want to say is it's a lot more than just ChatGPT. So most of you here today, you've probably heard of ChatGPT, or maybe you've heard of this broader category of tools called generative AI, this idea that we can make things, content, images, video, audio, these kinds of things can be created now very easily just by putting in a little bit of instructions or a prompt into a system. So that's certainly been very popular kind of AI, came on the scene in late 2022, and it's kind of been the game changer that's taken AI out to the masses. But the thing I want to say is that ChatGPT is literally one product. And while it's a really important product, it's also not the entirety of the field of AI. So the field of AI has been around for a very long time, since the 1950s. It's gone through many iterations. And more recently, we've kind of landed on this idea of machine learning, which I'm going to unpack a little bit later. But the first thing I want you to know is it's a lot more than just this one product, and it's a lot more than just generative AI. The next thing to know about AI is it's not really one thing. So we talk about AI like we all are on the same page when it comes to AI, and that's not necessarily the case. So if you can imagine if we only had one word to describe the four images that you see on the screen, and that word was vehicle. But when I was talking about a vehicle, I meant an e-scooter. And when Randall's talking about a vehicle, he meant an SUV, and somebody else meant an electric car, and somebody else meant a bicycle. And that's kind of where we're at with AI. It's this range of technologies. And so it's actually better to think of AI as a bit of a category term, an umbrella term, where we have a range of different kinds of technologies. Now, that's not to say these things don't have some things in common. They absolutely do, but they're not exactly the same thing. So that's something important to know. Another thing to know about AI is it's actually been woven into a lot of our digital infrastructure already, even before this latest iteration of generative AI. So if we think about life in the 21st century, we all have smartphones, those all have apps. We're having this talk right now on a platform. All of that has a layer of an infrastructure baked into it that involves some level of AI technologies. Even things like filtering your email for spam, nobody really thinks about that. That's actually an AI, an early use case of AI. So all of this to say is we've been living with AI for quite a while now, and it's not just these generative AI tools, it's this whole other layer. And what we're seeing right now, we're at an interesting moment when generative AI itself is being baked into some of these familiar tools, like Copilot is coming for Microsoft Office Suite, for example, is now baked in there, or we're seeing AI, generative AI, show up on online search. So all of this is kind of being woven together and becomes part of this bigger infrastructure. So as I was saying about the commonalities, so there's differences in the technologies, but there's some things that it shares in common. And what it shares in common is how it's made. So modern AI is made using a process of machine learning. And essentially what that's all about is finding patterns in large amounts of data. So we have massive amounts of data, big data, and then we have algorithms, machine learning algorithms, different sorts of them, and a bunch of computing power. And that's really it. There's these three ingredients that have come together that allow us to do the things that we're doing right now. So obviously I'm oversimplifying things a bit, but these are kind of the core things that are happening when it comes to modern AI. Now, data itself is not necessarily neutral. It's not necessarily just an objective thing. It's often problematic. And that's where we start to see some of the challenges when it comes to artificial intelligence. Things like algorithmic bias, for example. So I'm going to show you a very short video just to kind of illustrate how that works. And this is from one of the courses that I built for Athabasca University. So I have a series of courses with Athabasca University. It's a micro-credential in AI ethics. And this is just one video from that series that outlines this idea of how data can be problematic. So I'm going to go ahead and play that. I did share sound, but if you can't hear, do let me know. Sometimes things don't always go as planned, but we'll play that right now for you.
We've all heard the saying, numbers don't lie, but the truth is that data and statistical analysis aren't always as objective as we might hope. Biases may be introduced at different stages of data management, collection, and processing. When biases are encoded in AI training or testing data, it can have serious implications for fairness and justice. One common source of data bias is sample bias. It happens when the composition or demographics of a data set do not reflect the real-world population. Certain types of people or things might be overrepresented in the data. Others might be underrepresented. This can result in unequal outcomes when an AI model is deployed. For example, consider a machine learning model that is designed to evaluate candidates during video-recorded job interviews. If light-skinned people are overrepresented in the training data, the model might struggle to recognize or read the faces of dark-skinned candidates. This could harm their chances of getting the job. Another potential issue is historical bias. Data that was collected in the past does not always reflect current realities or future goals. Using that data to train algorithms can cause them to reproduce historical inequalities. For example, maybe developers want to train an algorithm to assess heart attack risk. They might use health system data from people who have been diagnosed with a heart attack in the past. Unfortunately, heart attacks have historically been underdiagnosed in women. The algorithm may learn to reproduce that discriminatory, life-threatening pattern. How developers define the problem that an algorithm aims to solve can also lead to biased outputs. This is known as framing bias. For instance, imagine that a credit card company wants to use AI to predict customers' creditworthiness. The developers must first define creditworthiness in a way that an algorithm can estimate or predict. Does the company want to maximize the number of loans that get repaid, or does it want to maximize its profits? The developer's goals will determine how they define creditworthiness and how the algorithm learns to predict it. If the company defines creditworthiness in terms of profit maximization, the algorithm might discover that giving subprime loans is an effective way to drive profits. This could lead to predatory lending that disadvantages low-income borrowers. To build AI systems that are reliable and fair, developers must take steps to limit these biases and others.
All right, so just a word about that video before I explain this concept of the mirror. So a lot of times when people talk about bias in data, they just talk about the data itself. And there's certainly biases that can happen in the data itself. And you saw some examples of that in the video. But equally as important is what are you doing with that data? And that's really what that creditworthiness example is trying to unpack, because there's some decisions that need to be made about what are we optimizing for. And so all of those things have ethical implications. Shannon Valor is a philosopher. She wrote a great book called The AI Mirror, came out last year. I highly recommend it. And what she says is all of this data that we have, it somewhat mirrors a lot of things that happen in society. And a lot of those things aren't necessarily the things that we want to continue to have happen in society. And unfortunately, we kind of get stuck in this loop sometimes when we use these systems to build artificial intelligence, because we're kind of always optimizing for something. So data is always a product of the past, but it gets used in ways that are trying to predict the future. And that can keep us stuck sometimes. So that's a little bit about artificial intelligence. That's as far as I'm going to go in terms of talking about the basics of the technology. I want to talk now about generative AI and your business. So I'm sure you've heard of generative AI. You're probably wondering if you haven't already experimented with it already, how might you use it in your business, in your small business? So what I find is that people want a set of common things from this technology. So one of the things they want to do is they want to be able to do more things faster, be more productive, be more efficient. And as small business owners, that's a reality. I'm a solo entrepreneur, so it's just me. I'm trying to always find the most efficient way to use my time. The other thing that we're trying to do is new things. So can we augment or extend our skill set? How might these tools allow us to do some things that we haven't been able to do before? So just as a for instance, you might have heard of the term vibe coding. It's this idea that those of us who are non-technical might be able to code something, an app or something like that, using these kinds of technologies. So you're leveling up your skill set in some way. And then the last thing is perhaps you already know how to do the thing, but you really don't like doing it. You just don't want to spend your time writing social media posts, but you know you got to get those social media posts out there because that's how you're marketing your business. And so a lot of times we're turning to these tools to handle what I call the administrivia of our business, the administrative tasks that we all have that aren't necessarily all that enjoyable. So those might not be all the things that we want generative AI to enable us to do, but those are some of the common categories that I see come up time and time again. So let's break this down a little bit more specifically and give some examples. So one way that we're using these tools is ideation and brainstorming. So you might take a tool like a ChatGPT, ask some questions, it gives you some feedback, you ask further questions, you're doing a mini brainstorming session. You might also use that, maybe leveraging off the brainstorming, to help manage a project in some way, do some workflow, do some administration. Maybe it's able to write sections of a report or something of that nature. So this is kind of managing the administrative side of your business. And of course, depending on what your business is, this is going to look a little bit different for different companies. Summarizing information is another big use case. So let's say you have a lot of documents you have to go to, you need the quick little snapshot. You can take a document and you can have it summarized so that you can get the gist of what is in the document. So taking big amounts of information, summarizing it down for you. Producing materials. I've broken this up into two parts. One is marketing materials. So this is a common use case, especially with the image generation tools. For example, maybe you need an image for a social media campaign or some copy for a social media campaign or an ad campaign. You can use these tools to produce those kinds of materials. But you also might have the kind of business where you can produce actual work product using these kinds of tools. And the reason I separate this out is that, for example, if you have a cleaning company, you're not necessarily going to benefit from this product producing work-related materials. It's not going to clean the homes for you. But if you have a professional services company, you're a lawyer or you're a marketing consultant, maybe there are some things that it can produce for you that will wind up in the work product that you deliver to your client. And I've separated those out because when we talk about risk, I'm going to talk about where we see more or less risk around doing that. And then there's things like customer service. So we've seen all kinds of uses for chatbots on websites, for example, to answer those basic questions that people have when they encounter your website, doing sort of that first level pass of customer service, or maybe even more than that. Some companies are building more sophisticated versions of chatbots as well. The reason I have an airplane on here is it's a reminder to later tell you a story about some of the risks associated with chatbots and some things that Air Canada encountered when they used their chatbots. So I'm going to get to that in just a minute. But chatbots are a very popular use case. All right, so we're always trying to balance risk and reward. So those are some of the things we might want to use the technologies for. Obviously, there's some benefits for doing that. But especially as a small business owner, you're really thinking also about the risks and making sure you're not incurring risks as you're trying to reap those rewards. So let me tell you the story of what happened with Air Canada and their chatbot. So they deployed a chatbot, and the chatbot gave a customer some bad advice. It told the customer that they could get a refund, and the customer went ahead and it kind of followed the advice of the chatbot. And then when that customer got in touch with an actual live representative at Air Canada, they said, no, that's completely wrong. That's not exactly how it works. Anyways, the entire thing went to court, and the court sided with the customer. And the reason this is important is it's now a legal precedent-setting case about chatbots. And essentially what the judge said is, look, you are responsible for the technology that you deploy as a business. Doesn't matter if it's a website or a chatbot or any kind of technology, you as the business are responsible. And I think that's really important to know as a business owner. And so this idea of taking responsibility for our product becomes important as we assess the risk of how we want to use these tools in our business. And that's one of the reasons I separated that idea of building work product out a little bit from something like marketing, though both can incur risks. So we'll talk a bit more about that in just a minute. All right, so managing risk. The way I'm thinking about this is that there are risks that are greater and there are risks that are definitely a risk, but maybe it's the one that you want to take given the upside potential. So I'm trying to frame this as a bit of a continuum. And the way I think about it is that when you have things that are customer facing versus back office, you could potentially be incurring more risk because now you're engaging with something that is directly impacting your customer. And that's why I put creating work product in this category of more risk than something like marketing. That's not to say there's no risk in using these tools to create social media posts, and you should definitely review everything that's coming out of these tools, but perhaps it's not necessarily the same kind of risk as if you gave a customer bad advice, they acted on it, and something negative happened in their business. So that's sort of a risk assessment that I do when I'm thinking about how I'm using these tools. Now, in the back office, there's going to be tasks that are more critical and there's going to be tasks that are less critical. And so definitely you can think about the criticality of the task being offloaded to an AI tool as also incurring greater risk. So the more critical the task, the more risk you're incurring. So that's the kind of thing that you should think about, especially as we're kind of moving into this next iteration where people are saying, well, you can use agentic AI, which is a bunch of different AI agents that can do tasks for you, maybe even purchase something for your business. And all you need to do is hand over your credit card to the bot. That would be an example of a more critical type of risk. So again, the key here is how are we overseeing these risks? How are we, knowing what the risks are, and then having a plan to manage and mitigate those risks. So we're getting as much benefit as possible and mitigating risk as much as we can as well while using these tools. All right. I'm going to do a couple more slides and then I'm going to actually have a chance for you to ask some questions before we get into the last part of the presentation. So the other thing I think a lot about, and that comes up a lot as an ethical question, is how much of me needs to be in any kind of a created product that I deliver. And I think about this in terms of a continuum again, and I have this analogy of baking. And so if we think about getting cupcakes, there's a couple ways that we could get cupcakes. One is we could make them from scratch ourselves. We could get all the ingredients out, make those cupcakes. It takes a lot of time to do that. Another way of getting there is we could use a cake mix. So we've got part of it, the work done, we add a few ingredients and bam, we've got our cupcakes that way. And then the last way is we can go and buy cupcakes that are pre-made. And if you think about using generative AI tools, there's an analogy there. You could go with whatever comes out of the generative AI tool. You could take that output and you could work with it more, kind of doing that cake mix thing. Or maybe this isn't the time and place to use a generative AI tool at all. This is the time and place for you to bake those cupcakes yourself, so to speak. And so you're going to do all the work yourself. And again, it comes down to assessing within the context of your business where on that continuum to lie and what the stakes are for the situation that you're in. Or if there are rules that say, hey, we don't want any store-bought or cake mix cupcakes. This is a baking contest. You better be baking those cupcakes yourself. That's pretty clear determination that you need to take that kind of a route. And sometimes clients might say that to you. I've had clients who've said, don't use any generative AI in producing this particular product. And then you need to just honor the terms of the agreement. So this baking analogy I find is a useful way of thinking about the different levels of use of generative AI. Now, all of this really is going to be a judgment call on your part, because essentially what you're doing is you're offloading tasks and you're automating them. And knowing when to do that, where to do that, how to do that is going to really depend on the context of your business. All right, before I kind of get into some of the hard truths about generative AI, I just want to pause for a minute because I've given you a lot of information. And I just want to see, is there any questions so far, things that you would like to see clarified?
The floor is open.
I just have a quick question. I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but I'm just thinking when you were talking about the risks, do you know, is this something now that if you were using a chatbot or using AI to produce a product, if that's something that would affect your liability insurance?
It's a fantastic question. And I don't know the exact answer, but it's actually on my mind right now because I recently just renewed insurance. And so I've been thinking about insurance. And of course, when you're doing your insurance, they ask you a lot of questions about cybersecurity and these kinds of things, right? And so my question for insurance agents is, are they going to be asking about AI? I think they should. Like, I think it's another risk. I think they should be asking about it. I think they should be assessing it again based on like how you're using it, what kind of business you are, like what are the stakes of using it? Are you using it for like legal or medical work or something high stakes, or is it something else? And so I think it's a great question. I don't know that they've totally figured that out, but it's something I'm really interested in finding out more about. So if I do find that out, I'll let Randall know and then he can let the group know. All right, I'm going to move on. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call the hard truths about generative AI. And the way I think about this, the ethical issues with generative AI, is in three buckets. One is who controls it, one is how we use it, and the other is how it's designed. So I'm going to unpack all of those three buckets because there's ethical concerns across the landscape here. So when we think about who controls these technologies, it's really a handful of companies that control what they sometimes call frontier models, foundation models, companies like OpenAI, for example. And these dynamics tend to favor monopolies and consolidations of power. So they tend to favor bigger companies who have a lot of money. They've managed to get this data, all that computing power, and so forth. And so there's a lot of concerns around that because it's not necessarily as democratic as it might seem. So that's a bit of an issue. When it comes to how it's made, there's also issues with the design choices. So you might have heard about the issues around the training data used in these products. It's a lot of data that's come from artists. There's open lawsuits right now around the copyright, and nothing has been settled yet. They're still trying to determine legally how to account for this. But ethically, I think there is, a question. Should we allow that data just to be hoovered up by those big companies and used in this way? And it's really come to head recently with some of the image generation tools. For example, that whole Studio Ghibli trend where everybody was turning themselves into animated characters recently. And the person who owned that studio, he is very, he didn't agree to any of that, to have any of his material used that way. And yet it gets used in that way. So this is really problematic. There's also biases in that training data. We talked about biased data earlier, and what tends to happen is it can amplify stereotypes. It can lead to certain kinds of things coming out of the data more often than not that might be problematic. And then there's a whole bunch of unethical ways. I call it the unethical supply chain of the data itself. So the idea that people who are often in poorer countries are paid very little to do all this data cleanup, and they're often exposed to a lot of unsavory or traumatic images because we've essentially taken much of the data that's on the internet has gone into the training data sets of these products. And then lastly, there's the environmental cost, all that compute power of processing all of that data. And that's leading to more data centers needing to be built. They're talking about bringing nuclear reactors online to power these data centers, or fossil fuels. Elon Musk is famously running a big data center in the States, and it's all fossil fuel generators that are powering this data center. So there's, at a time when we're thinking, about how to reduce our carbon footprint, these kinds of tools are actually increasing it. So all of these are design choices. And the hard thing about this, the two things I've just told you, the control and the design choices, is you don't really directly get a chance to impact that. However, indirectly, I think you can use your consumer voice to ask for better products. So what we need to do if we want to change those kinds of things is ask for what I call the fair trade coffee version of generative AI, because those kinds of ethical issues exist right now in the products that we have, and we can't necessarily change that unless we get different products. So that's a bit of an issue. We can think about how to use generative AI. This is where we have a little bit more control. How do you want to use these tools? The way I like to think about it is, if generative AI is kind of like sugar, do I want to sprinkle it everywhere? Do I want to use it sparingly? And I say it's like sugar because it can be somewhat addictive. It can be, you try it and you're like, oh, this is great, and I'm getting these benefits, and maybe I just want to use it everywhere. But also there's a cost to using it. And sometimes you don't always see that cost because it looks like a free tool to you, but the cost is borne by all of those design choices and things that I've been talking about previously. So my approach to it is I'm using it more sparingly. I'm kind of sprinkling it in certain places and not using it all the time. But everyone's going to have different choices when it comes to the use. So if you're thinking about, okay, how, give me some practical tips here. How do I use it? This is what I have to say about that. First and foremost, I think we can respect the copyright in terms of how we use the tool. So that's the prompt. That's the thing that you have the most control over. So I would say don't willfully incite a copyright violation. Don't ask the tool to do something that you know is a copyright violation. Like, for example, don't ask it to produce an animated character that you know is a copyrighted character. That's something that you have control over. And then I would also check to see what comes out of the system. So you might ask for a big orange cat that eats lasagna, and if it produces a picture of Garfield, you've got maybe a copyright issue on your hands, and maybe you don't want to prompt it to do that. So these are the kinds of things I think you can, again, control and have some agency in choosing to use it well. You should also take a scan through the terms and conditions for the tool. I would say that most of the tools have a line in their terms and conditions that say you're responsible for what you put into the tool in terms of the prompt. And whenever you're prompting, you're sharing data. So you kind of have to think about, it's not just a set of instructions. This data might wind up in the tool itself as future training data. When it comes to bias, it's something to be aware of. So first of all, just knowing that these tools can exhibit biases and don't accept exactly the defaults of the system. One of the biases with the writing tools is they tend to be over the top exuberant. They tend to be and urgent. So it tends to sound like really urgent salesy marketing copy. The first time that you use these things, you'll be alarmed by what comes out of them. And so maybe you're asking it to tone it down or doing another kind of application where it's not just delivering the first pass. You're then going, oh, okay, that sounds a little over the top. Let's tone that down and figuring out the next iteration of it. When it comes to images, you should be aware that it's biased towards delivering certain kinds of images that reflect the biases of society. So there was a study that was done where the prompt was to provide a picture of a CEO, and most times it was a white man that was provided as that picture. So if you know that that's a bias in a tool, you might want to prompt for a female CEO, for example. So again, it's going back to those misrepresentations and stereotypes, the mirror of society, and just correcting for them in your prompt. Respecting privacy is another thing that you can do. So don't put sensitive or personal information into your prompt. I think as small business owners, this is really important because sometimes maybe you want to personalize something for a customer, but in order to personalize it, you need to share a whole bunch of information about that customer. And maybe that customer doesn't agree to that, or maybe it's sensitive information. Those are the kinds of things you could be thinking about. Sometimes what I will do is I will change, or I won't put in anything about, a person's name or anything like that, but you might put in a category of a kind of person that you're trying to personalize towards, and then use that and then edit it later on. So just really be thinking about this idea of data sharing as you're using these tools and really respecting privacy. You also need to be the human in the loop, so don't rely on everything that comes out of these tools. Again, we've been talking about the ways in which they can have errors or biases in them, and don't over-rely on the tool. And over-rely is one of those squishy words. What does it mean to over-rely? I think, again, it's going to come down to individuals kind of making that decision for themselves. But I would say if you're at a place where you can't really do anything without the tool, that's probably problematic. So again, you're going to have to try it on and sort of feel what that line is for yourself. You also might want to retain certain things because you really enjoy doing them. This is me and writing. So I know I can use these tools to do a lot of writing, but I really like writing. And so I will wind up writing a lot of my own scripts for my videos or my courses, writing my own proposals, my own blog posts. I know I can use the tool for that, but I don't want to. And that's because I really enjoy it. That's why I'm here. That's why I do what I do. There are other things that I don't like doing. And some of these tools aren't quite there yet in terms of offloading those things. But if I had tools to do those things that I could rely on, I would probably get rid of those particular tasks. All right, and then this last piece, I've said this before, this idea of being accountable for what's produced by the tool. So taking responsibility for your use of AI, for the content that is created, or the advice that it gives if you're using it as a chatbot on your website, for example. I also think it's a good practice to disclose your use of AI and be transparent. And so if I'm generating an AI image, I might just have a small little disclosure at the bottom generated by AI. I will say that at a certain point, we may not necessarily need to do that. It might be so obvious what is AI and what is not, or maybe it's going to be so good that we don't know and we actually have to disclose it every time. Kind of interesting moment that we're in right now. And then kind of the obvious thing, like don't use it in ways that are going to create harm for others. So if you're, deep fakes, frauds, deception, I don't think this necessarily applies to anyone on this call, but kind of the obvious advice in being ethical is just not using it for unethical things. There's also a lot of kind of hype and this idea that you're being left behind. If you don't do this, if you haven't gotten into this already, you're going to be too far behind. And I would say push back on that. I mean, I think this is early days. If you look at the bigger, it's why I share the context of the history of AI being about 70 years. If you look at the big picture, the last couple of years is just tip of the iceberg. So if you're just starting to think about this and you're just getting started, that's totally fine. We're at where we're at. So I would just say resist the FOMO and these people that tell you you need to have this all figured out, a year ago or something like that. And then the last piece, kind of harkening back to that fair trade coffee kind of call for action, is to demand better choices. There are people working on this better, more fair version of generative AI. One of those people is this guy who quit his job at Stable Diffusion, and he is now spearheading this fairly trained initiative where he's trying to certify training data used for generative AI systems. So he's trying to fix that training data problem. And so I haven't followed up. This is from about a year ago. I haven't followed up to see where he's at. But the fact that he's working on the problem, I think, is a good thing. The other thing that's new that's happening right now, and this speaks to that control issue that I was talking about. Some of you might have heard of the Chinese model DeepSeek that was launched earlier in the year in January. It was a much smaller model, so it has some benefits from the environmental side of things, but also it can potentially democratize AI to make sure that it's not necessarily just controlled by those big tech companies. So there's a lot of interesting things right now in terms of model development that are trying to address that control issue as well. Open weight and open source is another aspect to that. So there's people working on these problems of how it's designed. And again, you're not going to solve these directly, but you can ask for those things as a consumer. And at the end of the day, what I advocate for is this idea of building a responsible AI culture. And so that can happen in your business as a small business owner, trying to ensure that your organization is trained, that if you're bringing generative AI into your organization, you're also bringing training into your organization to talk about these issues, to have an acceptable use policy so people know what's on side, what's not on side in terms of how this product can be used in your organization. So having all of that in place, I think, is really important. And then there's also this bigger sort of cultural context. We're all grappling with this at a personal level as well. And I think that there is imperative to kind of build that responsible culture in the bigger picture in society and figure out what are the use cases we want? What are the use cases we don't? And how do we make sure we're mitigating those risks from artificial intelligence? All right, so I'm going to end the talk there. If you want to connect with me, I'm mostly on LinkedIn, and feel free to find me there and send me a connection request. I also blog a lot about a bunch of different topics at ethicallyalignedai.com, my website. And I have this LinkedIn course using generative AI ethically at work that you might be interested in. You can find it through my website or through LinkedIn. But with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And we have a little bit of time. Oh, good. It's 1:45. So we have some time for questions. And I'd love to hear any questions that you have. It can be about the talk directly, or it can just be other things that you want to know about as it relates to AI. So I'll just maybe throw to Randall to help me moderate.
Sure, we'll open it up here for questions and answers. Katrina gave us a lot to think about, and that's why I've been recording this, because I'll post it on YouTube and give out a link so you can watch this again for a more in-depth analysis and all the complex implications of the use of AI in business. But let's continue then. Anyone have any questions or thoughts that you'd like to share?
Uh, I wanted to thank Katrina for the presentation. It was very comprehensive and an excellent overview of the issues that all organizations are facing as they contemplate adopting these tools. And I liked your emphasis on generative AI and distinguishing it from the sort of broader umbrella, because this is a unique category of technology. And I think I wanted to ask about your sense of the use of the term AI, which stands for artificial intelligence, and whether you think these tools as they currently exist and are presented to us, if that's a misnomer. Are we dealing with intelligence? Because I've been reading about this a lot, and I'm very torn as to whether, how profound they are and how much they are tricking us into thinking that they are profound.
Yeah, it's a fantastic and challenging question. I think that, the honest answer, I think, is everybody's all over the map on this. And a lot of it hinges on what do you believe intelligence is, right? Like, how are you defining intelligence? So on the one hand, if we think about something that we probably all would not consider this AI, a thermostat, right? So a thermostat can mechanically kind of control the temperature in a place, but we wouldn't necessarily say that's artificial intelligence. But in a way, it's sort of enacting something in the environment, right? It's changing the environment in some profound way, making it hotter, cooler, whatever, right? And so there's something interesting about that. Um, on the other hand, there's sort of a group that argues, well, it's not necessarily intelligent unless it sort of exhibits these human traits of intelligence, which we still have no agreement on. And they kind of go in that direction and say, no, it's not. And probably we're somewhere in the middle. And so I think it's really undefined at the moment and up for a lot of good debate as to what that exactly means at the end of the day. So yeah, super challenging question, Jeff.
Yeah, the other question I have is, like, I believe, as I said, I'm torn. I believe there is profound benefit that small businesses can achieve and attain through using these tools. But my fear always seems to come back to, based on our experience with computer technology and, the adoption of the PC and Excel and Word, um, even search engines. We're used to dealing with computer technology that is deterministic. It's a formulaic, it's a 0 and a 1, it's a binary output, and these tools are probabilistic.
Right.
And so it gives you a range of possibilities that sound plausible. And my fear is that small businesses and individuals are using these tools, and when they're first exposed, they get an amazing answer. They put a prompt in, they look for something, and they get something out that seems so fluid and so coherent, and they accept it without the critical thinking required to validate it. And the problem is that these probabilistic tools just make stuff up at times. They are probabilistically determining what is the most likely word to follow this word. And what they achieve through that scale is remarkable and amazing, but it's not always right. And yet I fear that we are accepting it too quickly as being right.
Yeah, and I definitely share your concerns, Jeff. And so this idea of, the hallucination, a couple things. So first of all, not all generative AI is made exactly the same way. So what they're trying to do to address that hallucination problem is to attach it to some kind of source of truth, call it a knowledge base of some source. So retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, is
Yeah.
how they're trying to address, or sometimes fine tuning, like retraining the model. So for example, I was spending time with a lot of the legal community in 2023, and they were talking about legal tech and trying to figure that out because they see a lot of benefits for using this for certain kinds of legal work, but it's not the same as Chat GPT. However, it doesn't totally address your issue either. So there's a bunch of things that are at play here. And so I go back to, like, we kind of think about this reasonably. What are the benefits and what are the risks? And you kind of try to take a bit of more of a risk mitigation frame on it. How could you achieve some of the benefits while mitigating your risks? It really becomes, what you feel comfortable turning over to that particular system to do. For example, like I have used, so sometimes I make short videos for some of my talks to illustrate a point. And I have used some of those tools to do things, and sometimes it gets it wrong. And sometimes that's a teaching opportunity for me. So I actually leave it in there and say, look, it got this thing wrong, or this happened, and that's why. And I'm actually doing that right now with some courses that I'm building. I again wrote most of it myself, but then I thought, use a little AI and see what happens. And then some things happened, like over the top language that I was talking about. And I was able to use that as a teachable moment and say, see, look at that over the top language. You would want to, if you were using this for real, you would want to correct that. And so as someone who's building courses, I find that useful as a teaching moment. But I do think it's an issue. And I think the issue is every time, if you rely on it and you're checking it and you're doing that time after time, there might be a time where you're like, I'm not going to check anymore. And that might be the time where it goes wrong. So I totally agree with what you're saying.
Yeah. And then one last question. You mentioned in your presentation the fair trade example of AI, of generative AI. And have you found one? Is there one that stands above others in relation to fair use or ethical use of information or training data, or the LLM that's based on?
Yeah, I hesitate to recommend anything directly because, so I'll tell you this story. I used to say it was Adobe. I used to say that because they were saying we're only going to use the licensed material that we have, and they were really trying to adhere to that. And then the story came out and said, oh, Adobe did some things that were a little offside from what they said. And then I'm like, oh, I can't use Adobe anymore. Maybe they fixed that. This is not a slam on Adobe at all, because I think they were trying to do the right thing, but maybe some things didn't go quite as planned. So I'm not really sure. If you wanted to look, I think it's fairly.ai. I think it's the name of that website. I can try and send Randall some links afterwards, but that's the person who's trying to do that whole process where he's trying to figure out how to pay people and that sort of thing. I think part of the problem is, some of these companies, they knew what they were doing was wrong, but they did it anyways. And a famous example of that is Meta. So there was an article in the Atlantic talking about Meta, the internal conversations that were happening, saying, yeah, we know this is copyrighted. We could pay for it, but let's not. Let's pirate it instead, and then we'll face the consequences. And I think it's that attitude that's the problem, right? Like they knew they were doing the wrong thing. And so how do we change that? That's kind of that's a bigger question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have to say an apology to some of the people who signed up for this, because after 45 years of using computers as an information worker, I still have difficulty navigating the systems, because I posted the link to this event on Meetup and Facebook and LinkedIn and Eventbrite, and people weren't able to use it. The thing is, if even a simple thing like posting a link to a video is problematic for somebody who's been using computers for 45 years, how much more problematic is it for us to digest the ins and outs of AI in our own small businesses? And I recently had my mind blown as I realized that we individual human beings, as smart as some of us are, probably don't have the imagination to comprehend the implications of artificial intelligence and its impact on civilization as a whole. Individually, in communities, in business sectors, right across the board, it is changing things in such ways that are just unimaginable. So I'm really grateful for having you to try to help us find our way into this new reality. I wonder now if any of the other guests here have any questions or comments. Dana?
Yeah, I just have a quick comment. I appreciated that you addressed the FOMO around this, because you're right, there is so much marketing. You're being left behind if you haven't started using AI. And, I also am a writer. I like writing. I want to do my own thing. I want to use sources that I trust. But at the same time, it's nice to have AI synthesize some information for me or help with ideas and stuff. So I see how beneficial. I have friends that are actively using AI for all sorts of things, and sometimes I feel like I just lack the imagination to even know, what I could ask AI to do for me. But it does create that FOMO feeling. So I really appreciated you making that comment. I also really liked your cupcake analogy. Um, that was very useful.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate, I mean, I think that figuring out how it's going to work for you is a very individual thing. So I'm not sure what your colleagues or friends are using it for, but maybe like I found sometimes, for example, people who don't like writing, they're super excited not to have to write anything. And so they're really leaning into it in that way. But for those of us who do enjoy that, it's not really going to help us necessarily. And maybe it's more the ideation or something else. So yeah, I think it's just a process of figuring it out for yourself.
So historically, a lot of us have become information workers in the last generation. And a lot of us have that inclination to write up our own books or articles. And of course, how could you not tap the knowledge base of the modern civilization by using ChatGPT or some other AI? And I have myself been wondering, well, how do I take credit for this? Is this a collaboration between myself and ChatGPT? Is it a collaboration between myself and the rest of the world? How do you give credit? If I post something on Facebook or on Quorum or something that's been at least where I've used AI, do I need to give credit? How, because the seems to me, as you're saying, the kind of the distinction between public and private has become much more blurred in this world.
Yeah, it's a huge issue. I mean, I think that, I think about credit and I think about this concept of plagiarism, for example, in post-secondary. What is plagiarism in this new world that we're in? What does that look like? It used to be so clear, right? And I think kind of that's why I find that cupcake analogy a bit useful. So for me, if you put in a prompt, a bunch of copy came out, you post that and say this was written by Randall Adcock, and that was that, I would say that from my perspective, that's a little problematic. So you've kind of just used it as is and haven't really done anything to it. Though I know that's happening all the time. If you've remixed it in some way, then I feel that that's more like the cupcake mix analogy, where you put some things into it yourself, and maybe it's fine to say it's you. And of course, if you didn't use any AI at all, then obviously you wrote it. So that's one part of the piece. In terms of credit, I think that it's tricky because what are you actually crediting? Is it the tool? Is it something else? You're not going to know who to credit, whose work was actually used to generate that, unless there are specific links. Some of them are coming back with we use this source and that source to get this particular answer, and you might want to then cite those sources. But I think it becomes a little bit trickier. However, I do think it's going back to this idea of disclosure. I do think it is helpful to be transparent and say that AI was used if it was in any way, shape, or form in a process. I know that's probably not giving you a hard and fast rule or anything, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about it.
And that's typical of the way of the world today, isn't it? It's like it is all getting more gray as everything's interconnected with everything else.
Yeah.
And so we've got to address that root problem
Yeah.
sooner or later. And that's something I'm working on separately. But we're closing in on 1 o'clock here, the end of the hour. I wonder, are there any other questions? Lloyd, for example, I know you've worked with Katrina on security and AI.
That's a different topic, but just some of the things that you folks just mentioned a minute ago kind of raised a red flag in my brain. Randall, I sent you a slide deck about something I call hire for HIPAA, train for skill. I spent money to put a copyright on that, 20 years ago. And I just got thinking, sure, I've got two of those that have copyright protection, if you want to call it that. But what does protection mean nowadays if you and I was to put that, we do a live session on Zoom or whatever, and you post it on the Wayfinders website, what's to stop anybody anywhere now to include that information in their whatever they're doing? Does the copyright really mean anything anymore? Probably not much, eh, Katrina?
It's a fantastic point, Lloyd. I mean, you could almost say like anything that's done in a public fashion, like post on YouTube or anything of that, this, what we're doing right now, will probably get sucked in and used as training data for something. So I think that's probably the way things are at the moment. And it's very hard for individual copyright owners to address that. Like we're not necessarily going to, even those who have the wherewithal to launch lawsuits, it's a very expensive endeavor. And right now it's very unclear, nothing's been settled. These things take years to go through the court systems. And how would you prove, that it was used? And so it's a very complicated situation, I would say. So, I mean, if you're not comfortable with that, then I think my best advice is don't allow for it to be recorded and distributed publicly in that way. That would be the best way to kind of put your own protections on these things. It means though that you can't your content can't go out to a broader audience online. So that's the trade-off that you would have, right? If you only used it for in-person workshops, let's say, or something of that nature.
Well, it's probably less of a concern for somebody my age, but I'm just thinking about younger people who are, half my age, and they're starting to think about doing things like this, and they have a lot more at risk.
But Lloyd, do you think that younger people are as concerned with the privacy of their information as my generation or your generation is? Because they seem very comfortable in relinquishing their privacy rights
You're right.
to the universe. Right. It's all out there.
Yeah.
I'm not sure they're concerned like I am.
No, I think you're 100% correct.
Yeah. I had another question, and it's based on what Dana had asked earlier in your comments about the FOMO. And this is again where I'm torn because I believe this is profound technology. This is world changing, maybe on the scale of the internet, introduction of the internet in the 90s. And I believe that the only way to figure out how to use these tools is by experimenting and trying them out. And in order to get people to do that, I understand why there is hype, right? I understand why people are being encouraged. And I'm trying to counterbalance that fear of missing out with the responsible and ethical guidelines that you've shared with us. And I'm torn because I believe companies, small businesses, individuals should be using this. And I'm only using it experimentally. I'm retired, but I use it wherever I can. Not that I share that anywhere, but I'm experimenting with it constantly. And as Ethan Mollick talks about the jagged edge, the jagged frontier of these generative AIs, there are some applications for which they are remarkably useful. And then there's other areas in which they are remarkably dumb and dangerous. And you can't predict where that jagged edge is going to appear. And so the way to do that is by experimenting and not, immediately trying to deploy or to use that output that you've achieved. And so I'm struggling with that because I do believe that people, like I read somewhere just recently, 60% of adults in the US have to this day not tried ChatGPT. And I'm astounded by that. In a survey, the Pew Research did a survey, 60% of adults haven't even tried it. Everybody has heard about it in the media because it's got nonstop coverage, but people aren't trying it. And so they're not responding to that FOMO that is so out there. And I can't understand why more people haven't tried it out yet, because there are so many possible applications. If you aren't sure, Dana, of where to use it, just use it, just try it and see. What do you get? You might get garbage and it might not be useful at all. And it might just knock you off your socks off. So I'm torn with how much to encourage and to, try to and get people to try it out versus, attending to the risks and dangers that are inherent in it.
Yeah. Can I ask, what was your business prior to retiring? What did you do?
I was in HR for 35 years.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
But a lot of focus on technology in that time.
right. So I think so going back to this idea of biases, I think everyone on this call probably has a white collar knowledge worker bias.
Mhm.
Because if we were in a world where our job wasn't centered around doing something on a computer, maybe we wouldn't necessarily, maybe we're that 60% that if we had a physical job, we wouldn't necessarily gravitate towards it, at least as first movers or early adopters, right? So I was on this call. I have to check this bias on myself all the time because I was on a call where someone reminded me they came from the world of construction, for example, and they were doing more physical construction work, and that was, their world. And they said, for those folks, it's not necessarily in the job woven into things the way it would be for us. So that's kind of, and I'm not saying that's necessarily what happened in the Pew study, but that might be some of it. And then in terms of how it would help you in your personal life or what beyond just the novelty of writing a country song or something like that, I've been thinking about this too, like how would you use it to do personal things in your life that are actually useful, not just the entertainment. And I struggle with that because I'm not really sure exactly what that looks like. I did this exercise where I literally wrote out everything that I do in a day from getting up in the morning and showering to making breakfast to, doing my work and all that. And the part that where I could see these tools most clearly was in the work part, but not necessarily in all these personal pieces. So I do kind of wonder about that as well. I don't know if maybe you found some use cases in your personal life where you find it fantastic. And if so, I think we'd love to hear them. But yeah, I'm curious about that.
No, I think you're
I
right.
am.
You're right
Oh,
about the
sorry, go
bias
ahead.
from you're right about the bias from my type of work. Absolutely. So I know that I'm probably a subset, and I typically am an early adopter in other realms as well. So yeah, that's true.
Maybe this is naive and simplistic, but I was just thinking maybe in some situations when we're just trying to learn some of this stuff, we need to ask some questions. Take the approach that a good detective does. He or she asks the question to which they already know the answer
Hmm.
and see what answer you get, and now
Right.
compare it.
Yeah.
Uh,
As far as personal use, some of my ADHD clients are really finding the AI useful for things like meal planning, grocery lists, budgeting,
Hmm.
um, even just I have a client who is just a superstar with her AI, and she will list the type of ingredients she has in her pantry and ask AI for suggestions on meals she can make with it. Grocery lists getting built, saying, I need a grocery budget for a week. This is my food intolerances for Superstore in Spruce Grove. Um,
I'll
with
give you,
no cilantro. And boom, she's got her grocery list. It's followed her budget. So I mean, for personal use, there are really endless possibilities there as well.
can I give you another example, which I know has some privacy concerns, but I'm going to share it because I did try to accommodate that. But I was accompanying a family member to a doctor's appointment, which I recorded on my iPhone. And the iPhone now uses AI to automatically transcribe the hour-long interview into a text document. The doctor also provided notes, handwritten notes, and a radiology report in a PDF. I anonymized that information, so I stripped out any personal details, and I loaded all of that information into ChatGPT. And I said, now you're an expert in this particular subset of medicine. I want you to help me to understand what the doctor was saying in layman's terms and help me to understand the care plan. And what it produced was remarkable and insightful and more understandable for me. Like I could not understand the radiology report, but it made it comprehensible. And I could also then interrogate the interview and the documentation in a way that wasn't possible. And with our healthcare system, you don't get the kind of time you need with an expert physician I mean, when you're there, you're just trying to absorb what's going on. So this allowed me to interrogate that information after the fact, which was, I think, remarkably useful, and we benefited from it tremendously. So that's another application. And my son, who went through a recent health struggle last year, was using it throughout his treatment to fill in the gaps between his consults with his physician. I also found it profoundly useful because it is, as Randall said, we're talking about a tool or tools that have absorbed the entirety of human civilization's information base. And that includes research papers. It includes, Wikipedia, every article that's written about all of this stuff, much more current than even your physician could be. So that's another use case that for me, in those circumstances in the last 6 months or a year, were profoundly useful.
So a couple
Is that
things.
FOMO, Dana? Does that sound like I'm overhyping it? Because that was a remarkable experience for me.
Well, and I'm surprised that you did that, given your other questions that you asked me earlier and your concerns, because I would not advocate to use it for medical advice. That's my, I've been spending a lot of time with the medical.
It wasn't for medical advice. It was to understand the advice.
Yeah, or I guess to summarize sensitive details and that sort of thing. So that wouldn't necessarily be my position on that. And it's interesting. I've been working on another project with a bunch of clinicians, and they think that there will be some uses in the healthcare system, more on the administrative side. They're wanting it to do their own kind of transcription and note-taking. AI scribes is kind of the hot new thing right now for them. But they're very cautious about the clinical side of things in terms of using it in that way. And that's from clinicians. So I think it's really interesting to hear, like, not just from people who are vendors who are building the tools, because they're going to tell you, of course, use it everywhere. But from the clinicians themselves who are a little bit more cautious.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up here, but you've given us a lot to think about, Katrina, and very good questions from our group here today. I am reminded that with every new disruptive platform technology, there's a burst of diverse applications and then a period of evolution. So some of these technologies emerge in ways that are unexpected, and others just disappear. And so we can expect that to happen, and we shouldn't be too concerned. But and when it comes to hitching our wagon to which horse, this is going to be challenging for us because there's so many things happening right now. Which one is most likely to be sustained by our society? So it is difficult. But we're going to find our way through this one way or another. And thank you all for this wonderful dialogue conversation. We have to keep these conversations going as part of our collective intelligence, supplemented by AI. And we're going to be doing this on a regular basis with Wayfinders every Friday at noon, right here on Zoom, alternating between guest speakers like Katrina, and maybe we'll have Ken or Jeff or Lloyd or Dana. Dana is actually coming up on May 23rd, is it? So we'll be continuing this kind of conversation, alternating with what we call the mastermind sessions. It's a community of practice of small businesses sharing their best practices. Again, it's a kind of a collective intelligence that we're trying to achieve here, from which we all can benefit. win-win kind of environment. Katrina, any other final last words?
No, just thanks so much. It's been a great conversation. I love hearing what's on your mind, and it's a learning experience for me. So thanks so much for the invite.
Right, and we'll be posting this on YouTube, and I'll send out links to that. So if there's nothing more, thank you all very much, and thank you, Katrina, for the wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Katrina.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. That was fantastic. Have a great weekend, everyone.